Well, good morning. Thank you for joining me either at this particular time, 9 o'clock, or for those of you who watch later. Um, I will be doing chapter 12 of The Great Divorce. This is a remarkable chapter. It's probably, in some respects, one of the more literary chapters in the book. So, his description of heaven and of people, the kind of people who are in there, is unique in this particular chapter. And he's really creating a very stark contrast between a number of the characters on purpose. And he is addressing um, maybe something that we have seen in our lifetime, and that is that truly remarkable person, that unique, amazing individual who is able to thrive and do phenomenal things despite the difficult circumstances, who remain undaunted by their circumstances and still find a way to live their life faithfully and even with joy. And even though they may have veritable black holes in their lives that suck so much away of the vitality of what they are, the meaning, the purpose, the character, the integrity, the godliness, that these people still excel and make a difference. And I think I've known a person or two like that in my life. In some respects, this person, the woman here, reminds me a little of my own mom. So I have kind of an emotional attachment to this chapter. So, we go then. Let me just go ahead and get started. The reason why I asked if there were another river was this. All down one long aisle of the forest, the undersides of the leafy branches began to tremble with dancing light. And on earth, I knew nothing so likely to produce this appearance as the reflected lights cast upward by moving water. A few moments later, I realized my mistake. Some kind of procession was approaching us, and the light came from the persons who composed it. First came bright spirits, not the spirits of men who danced, and scattered flowers, soundlessly falling, lightly drifting flowers, though by the standards of the ghost world, each petal would have weighed 100 weight, and their fall would have been like the crashing boulders. Then on the left and right, on each side of the forest avenue, came youthful shapes, boys on one hand and girls upon the other. If I could remember their singing and write down the notes, no man who read that score would ever grow sick or old. Between them went musicians, and after these, a lady whose honor all of this was being done. And so you get this procession that's magnificent. And you get this sense of life and energy and vitality and joy, all in honor of this particular woman. I cannot now remember whether she was naked or clothed. If she was naked, then it must have been the almost visible penumbra of her courtesy and joy, which produces in my memory the illusion of a great and shining train that followed her across the happy grass. If she were clothed, then the illusion of nakedness is doubtless due to the clarity with which her innermost spirit shone through her clothes. For clothes in that country are not a disguise. The spiritual body lives along each thread and turns them into living organs. A robe or a crown is there as much one of the wearer's features as a lip or an eye. So you get this sense of utter transparency, and out of that transparency was just this joy and love and vitality, holiness, goodness, those kinds of things. And so in our world we make a big distinction about whether or not a person wears clothing or not. We wear clothing to hide our shame, to remain modest, those kinds of things. So there's stuff that we want to keep from other people seeing. But in heaven, he's saying nakedness takes on a whole different kind of thing, a whole different meaning and characteristic that if a person's clothed, then they are clothed in honor, in goodness, and in love and joy. That's what their clothing is. And if they are naked, it's because there's this transparency, this openness of heart that everybody can see, that isn't hidden in any way. So it's a refreshing, I think, and unique way in terms of how we might understand heaven to be. And I think helpful and probably accurate. But I have forgotten, and only partly do I remember, the unbearable beauty of her face. Is it? I whispered to my guide. Not at all, he said. It's someone you have never heard of. Her name on earth was Sarah Smith, and she lived at Golders Green. So Lewis takes this person who has a rather unremarkable name, Sarah Smith, which is a pretty average name, and she lives in Golders Green, which is some remote place that not too many people knew about. And so, while on earth she may not have been heard of, in heaven she's being honored in this unbelievable way. She seems to be, well, a person of particular importance, says the main character. Yes, she is one of the great ones. You have to understand that fame in this country and fame on earth are two quite different things. And who are these gigantic people? Look, they're like emeralds who are dancing and throwing flowers before her. Haven't you read your Milton? 1,000 liveried angels lackeyed her. In other words, Lewis lifted a line from Milton where a person was being honored, and she is such an honorable person that the angels themselves honor her. And so these gigantic figures that are throwing flowers before Sarah Smith in heaven are honoring Sarah Smith. Even though they are angels, they are honoring her for the type and nature and the kind of person that she was on earth. And who are all these young men and women on each side? They are her sons and daughters. She must have had a very large family, sir. The MacDonald responds, every young man or boy that met her became her son, even if it was only the boy who brought the meat to her back door. Every girl that met her was her daughter. Isn't that a bit hard on their parents? No. There are those that steal other people's children, but her motherhood was of a different kind. Those on whom it fell went back to their natural parents, loving them more. Few men looked on her without becoming, in a certain fashion, her lovers. But it was the kind of love that made them not less true, but truer to their own wives. And so here's this woman who, while on earth, every encounter that she had this capacity to make them better people in terms of the position that they had in life. So if a person was a son or a daughter and encountered her, the kind of mother that she was transformed them. And so when they went back to their parents, they were better children and they loved their parents more. And for every adult male that bumped into her, they loved who she was, for the kind of person that she was. And she raised them up, her nature, her character, raised them up so that when they left the encounter from her and went back to their own wives, they were even better husbands to their wives. She was a transformational figure, comprehensively across the board for anyone who encountered her. She was that vital. She was that weighty. She was that significant in the lives of other people. So this is why she's being honored, because of the kind of impact that she had on so many lives, regardless of what kind of people they were and where they came from. She was a major player in the transformation of many, many people in the world in which she lived, just because of who she was, not because of a program, not because of a church, not because of anything like that, not because of an office, just because of the authenticity and the significance of what she was as a person. So the main character continues, and how, but hello, what are all these animals? A cat, 2 cats, dozens of cats, and all these dogs. Why can't I count them? And the birds and the horses. They are her beasts. Did she keep a sort of zoo? I mean, this is a bit too much. Every beast and bird that came near her had its place in her love. In her, they became themselves. And now the abundance of life she has in Christ from the Father flows over into them. So this is a kind of a terrible example, but you'll get the sense of which, if any of you saw the very old Walt Disney Snow White, and how Snow White related to the animals of the forest, that's almost the kind of imagery I get here, where the animals are just naturally attracted to her. They sense her goodness and her love, and they bond with her. So even with animals, with children, with adults, and with animals, she just had this transformational impact on all of their lives. So Lewis is painting this person who is an exception, who is truly phenomenal in how they live their life. So he says, I looked at my teacher in amazement. Yes, he said, it's like when you throw a stone into a pool and the concentric waves spread out further and further. Who knows where it will end? Redeemed humanity is still young, but it has hardly come to its full strength. But already there is joy enough in the little finger of a great saint, such as yonder lady, to waken all the dead things of the universe into life. And so she has, in her glorified state, were this world to see it, to be revealed to it, that glorification of what Christ has made her would raise things to life. So I mean, that's an embellishment, I think, on Lewis's part, but he's trying to show what happens to those who are truly, truly faithful in heaven, how God completes them. And so in heaven, in their completed form, if they were to come to earth, would have a magnificent, even unbelievable impact upon the world in which we live. While we spoke, the lady was steadily advancing toward us, but it was not at us she looked. Following the direction of her eyes, I turned and saw an oddly shaped phantom approaching, or rather, 2 phantoms, a great tall ghost, horribly thin and shaky, who seemed to be leading on a chain another ghost no bigger than an organ grinder's monkey. If you remember what an organ grinder is, it's a person that had that little organ that he would grind like this, and there was a monkey that would dance to that. You'll see him in depictions in France or Paris, those kinds of things. And so it was that kind of a thing that she saw, or he saw. The taller ghost wore a soft black hat and reminded me of something that my memory could not quite recover. Then, when he had come within a few feet of the lady, he spread out his lean, shaky hand flat on his chest and his fingers wide apart, and exclaimed in a hollow voice, "At last!" All at once, I realized what it was that he'd put me in mind of. He was like a seedy actor of the old school. "Darling, at last," said the lady. "Good heavens," thought I. "Surely she can't." And then I noticed two things. In the first place, I noticed that the little ghost was not being led by the big one. It was the dwarfish figure that held the chain in its hand, and the theatrical figure that wore the collar around its neck. In the second place, I noticed that the lady was looking solely at the dwarf ghost. She seemed to think it was the dwarf who had addressed her, or else she was deliberately ignoring the other. And so the initial view was that it was the tallish, dramatic, theatrical figure who was the real person. But in reality, the real person was the dwarfish figure, and it was the dwarfish figure that was leading the tall figure by a chain. And so the tall figure was an emanation that came out of the dwarf. The tall figure was a representation, a kind of reflection of who the dwarf really was, or who the dwarf really projected himself to be. And so the inner character of the dwarf represented himself as this tall theatrical figure, and so that's important to understand as we move along here. On the poor dwarf she turned her eyes. Love shone not only from her face, but from all of her limbs, as if she were some liquid in which she had just been bathing. Then, to my dismay, she came nearer. She stooped down and kissed the dwarf. It made one shudder to see her in such close contact with that cold, damp, shrunken thing. But she did not shudder. So her love and the composition of her character enabled her to not only look at this dwarf and to talk with him, but to be affectionate towards him as well, to actually love him. And so she is doing in heaven here what she did on earth, where it was this unconditional love. All of us have encountered unbelievably unattractive people, either physically or unattractive in terms of their nature, and usually we avoid them. But that's not what she did. She engaged him, and she referred to him in an affectionate manner, and engaged him in a physically affectionate manner by kissing him. Then her first thing that comes out of her mouth is this: "Frank," she said, "before anything else, forgive me." "Forgive me," she said, "for all I ever did wrong, and for all I did not do right. Since the first day we met, I ask your pardon." Pretty amazing, isn't it? That here's this person that made the kind of impact that she did, and yet the first words out of her mouth to a person who clearly did not seem as if they deserved it, a comment, a request for forgiveness for how she may have wronged him, for how she may not have done everything that she should have done. I looked properly at the dwarf for the first time now, or perhaps when he received her kiss, he became a little more visible. One could just make out the sort of face he must have had when he was a man. A little, oval, freckle face with a weak chin and a tiny wisp of an unsuccessful mustache. He gave her a glance, not a full look. He was watching, and so Lewis is calling this tall figure a tragedian. So a tragedian is an actor who acts out tragedies on the stage. He was watching the tragedian out of the corner of his eyes, that is, dwarf. Then he gave a jerk to the chain, and it was the tragedian, not he, who answered. So it was this reflection, this emanation, this projection of himself, this tragic figure that he would make to talk to Sarah Smith. There, there, said the tragedian. We'll say no more about it. We all make mistakes. With the words, there came over his features a ghastly contortion, which I think was meant for an indulgently playful smile. We'll say no more, he continued. It's not myself I'm thinking about. It's you. That is what has been continually on my mind all these years. The thought of you here alone, breaking your heart about me. But now, said the lady to the dwarf, you can set all that aside. Never think like that again. It's all over. Her beauty brightened so that I could hardly see anything else. And under that sweet compulsion, the dwarf really looked at her for the first time. For a second, I thought he was growing more like a man. He opened his mouth. He himself was going to speak this time. But oh, the disappointment when the words came. And so each time the dwarf has some kind of encounter with Sarah Smith, he becomes her character causes him to become a little more visible. Her character causes him to grow a little more like he should be as a man. But when he spoke, this is what came out that was so disappointing. You missed me? He croaked in a small, bleeding voice. Yet even then she was not taken aback. Still the love and courtesy flowed from her. Dear, you will understand about that very soon, she said. But today, what happened next gave me a shock. The dwarf and tragedian spoke in unison, but not to her, but to one another. You'll notice, they warned one another, she hasn't answered our question. I realized then that they were one person, or rather that both were the remains of what had once been a person. The dwarf again rattled the chain. You missed me, said the tragedian to the lady, throwing a dreadful theatrical tremor into his voice. Let me read that again. You missed me, said the tragedian to the lady, throwing a dreadful theatrical tremor into his voice. Dear friend, said the lady, still attending exclusively to the dwarf, you may be happy about that and about everything else. Forget all about it forever. And really, for a moment, I thought the dwarf was going to obey. I thought the dwarf was going to obey, partly because the outlines of his face became more clear. So again, she pulled him a bit more into her orbit, and he became a bit more infinitesimally, but a bit more like her. I thought the dwarf was going to obey, partly because the outlines of his face became a little clearer, and partly because the invitation to all joy, singing out of her whole being, like a bird's song on an April evening, seemed to me such that no creature could resist it. Then he hesitated, and then once more he and his accomplice spoke in unison. Of course, it would be rather fine and magnanimous of not to press the point, they said to one another. But can we be sure she'd notice? We've done these sort of things before. There was the time we let her have the last stamp in the house to write her mother, and said nothing, although she had known we wanted to write a letter ourselves. We thought she'd remember and see how unselfish we'd been, but she never did, And there was a time, oh, lots and lots of times. So the dwarf gave a shake to the chain. And so now the dwarf and the tragedian are talking about how when they were with Sarah, apparently they were married, that, they gave up the last stamp in the house so she could write a letter to her mother. And they saw that as being magnanimous, unbelievably magnanimous and unselfish on their part, and didn't hold it over their head. And so there'll be other examples, I think, like this, where they try to show how they are like her when in reality they are the exact opposite of what she really is. So the dwarf gave a shake to the chain and, "I can't forget it," cried the tragedian, "and I won't forget it either. I could forgive them all they've done to me, but for your miseries." "Oh, don't you understand?" said the lady. "There are no miseries here." "Do you mean to say," answered the dwarf, as if this new idea made him quite forget the tragedian for a moment, "do you mean to say you've been happy?" "Didn't you want me to be? But no matter. What, want it now? I don't think about it. Do I want happiness now? No, I don't think about it at all." The dwarf blinked at her. One could see an unheard of idea trying to enter his little mind. One could see even that there was for him some sweetness in it. So, so the dwarf is coming to terms with the fact that she could be happy in heaven and happy apart from him. And he considers it for just a nanosecond. And it looks as if he's about to let loose of the chain of the tragedian, that projection of himself, that dramatic figure that he used to try and control her when she was on earth. For a second, he almost let the chain go, as if it were his lifeline, but then he clutched it even more. "Look here," said the tragedian. "We've got to face this." He was using his manly, bullying tone this time, the one for bringing a woman to her senses. "Darling," said the lady to the dwarf, "there's nothing to face. You don't want me to have been miserable for misery's sake. You only think I must have been if I loved you. But if you only wait and see, that isn't so." "Love," said the tragedian, striking his forehead with his hand. And then a few notes deeper, "Love. Do you know the meaning of the word?" "How should I not?" said the lady. "I am in love. In love, don't you understand? Yes, now I love truly." "You mean," said the tragedian, "you mean you did not love me truly in the old days?" "Only in a poor sort of way," Sarah Smith said. "I have asked you to forgive me. There was a little real love in it, but what we called love down there was mostly the craving to be loved. In the main, I loved you only for my own sake, because I needed you." "And now," said the tragedian with a hackneyed gesture of despair, "now you need me no more?" "But of course not," said the lady, and her smile made me wonder how both the phantoms could refrain from crying out with joy. "What needs could I have?" she said. "Now that I have all. I am full now, not empty. I am in love himself, not lonely, strong, not weak. You shall be the same. Come and see. We shall have no need for one another now. We can begin to love truly." But the tragedian was still striking attitudes. "She needs more. No more, no more," he said in a choking voice to no one in particular. "Would to God," he continued, but now he was pronouncing it God, G-U-D, "and would to God I had seen her lying dead at my feet before I heard those words. Lying dead at my feet, lying dead at my feet." I do not know how long the creature intended to go on repeating the phrase, but the lady put an end to that. Frank! Frank, she cried in a voice that made the whole wood ring. Look at me! Look at me! What are you doing with that great ugly doll? Let go of the chain. Send it away. It is you I want. She didn't want the tragic figure that the dwarfish person used to control her. She wanted him. She was trying to save him. Merriment danced in her eyes. She was sharing a joke with the dwarf right over the head of the tragedian. Something, not at all unlike a smile, struggled to appear on the dwarf's face, for he was looking at her now. Her laughter was past his first defenses. He was struggling hard to keep it out, but already with imperfect success. Against his will, he was even growing a little bigger. Oh, you great goose, she said. What is the good of talking like that here? You know as well as I do that you did see me lying dead years and years ago. Not at your feet, of course, but on the bed of a nursing home. A very good nursing home it was, too. Matron would never have dreamed of leaving bodies lying on the floor. It's ridiculous for that doll to try to be impressive about death here. It just won't work. So this completes this completes this chapter 12, but in chapter 13, this story continues on, and it's more of a complex part of the story, and it really sets the stage for the last chapter or two of this book. So I'm going to end it here in terms of what I want to try and get to, because I'm going to need as much or more time next week to unpack chapter 13. So what are the takeaways here? The takeaways are that there is this woman named Sarah Smith who lived this unbelievably remarkable life despite what are very clearly significant challenges. That she was married to this guy named Frank, who was the opposite of everything that she was. She was loving and kind, good and gracious. Her life transformed. She made the world and people a better place. The impression that we get from this dwarfish figure and this tragedy and this apparition that was a tragedy, and that he was incredibly selfish and self-centered, and that she still managed to love him, but even in her love on earth, even though that love transformed so many things around it, it was not successful in transforming him because of the depth and the nature and the severity of his selfishness and self-centeredness, and that he wanted this figure that she was, this incredible person. She wanted her life to be in orbit totally and solely around them or it, and she was not that. And then, so because of the kind of person she was in heaven, Lewis depicts her as a person that is rewarded in an unbelievable manner. I mean, who here on earth would not want to be rewarded by God? And definitely, that certainly would not be me, and I don't have enough time to make it up, if that is a reality. And so, while there in heaven, she encounters Frank, who's finally died, and this apparition of his, this tragedy, and so there's this incredible contrast between the two, and so he can't believe that she really didn't miss him and didn't want to live on his behest. And so that's kind of where we are. And we see, I think one of the other takeaways is that despite the toxicity of what he was, that we get hints of where in his encounter with her and this this overwhelming magnificence of the kind of person that she is, that he's being drawn to that, so his features become a little more clear. He becomes a little more tall, those kinds of things in those encounters. But it doesn't, but it, but there's more to the story. And so we're going to see what happens when we are presented here. So Lewis presents this tragedy and this dwarf with what, at least so far, the best possible, most glorified kind of person we have experienced thus far in heaven. And what is his response? How will he respond to this magnificent figure? And in what way may that or might that not change him so that he wants to become like her? Because she is like Christ, and Christ is the one who's glorified her. So we're going to find in chapter 13 what happens. So I think that, one of the applications would be here, who among us is like this Sarah Smith? That no matter whom we encounter, our life transforms theirs. Our life causes them to live better lives. So, and it's not because of some program or some church or some event or whatever. It's just because of who we are. And so, by the world standards, who is there among us that live rather unremarkable lives according to the world, but according to the God of heaven, we live unbelievably faithful lives, and what lies in store for us is to become like Sarah Smith. So let's see what happens in chapter 13 next week. All right. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.